Hello everyone, my name is Gloria Tomezzoli. I'm here as a volunteer with the Francesca Rava Foundation. I'm here today because I feel that this topic, biodiversity loss, is taken for granted. We are talking about climate change more and more each day, and while it is crucial for us to do so, we must not forget that we have one last chance to avert climate change. With biodiversity, we do not have that. As a matter of fact, once a species is extinct, there is no going back. For many people living in towns and cities, wildlife may be something they only see on television, but it's so much more than that. As a matter of fact, the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food we eat all rely on biodiversity. As a 17-year-old student, I feel anxious about the future, not just for me, but also for generations to come after me as well. On the other hand, being here and seeing so many people who care gives me strength and hope for the future. But I fear we are missing one fundamental ingredient: political will. Nevertheless, I still see a future where our world leaders will come together with a definitive and effective plan of action. Thank you very much.
It's always so inspiring to hear these kids talk, really, and they awaken a strong sense of responsibility. I would like to invite my 4 very diverse men to the stage. It'll be an interesting panel because we will really be seeing biodiversity from their different perspectives. So we have Dan Altschuler-Malek, we have Michael van Koosten, we have Mike Lee, and Emilio Petrucci. Welcome, welcome. I will sit here, yes, at the far end. So, just a few words about our speakers, starting over there from Michael. Michael is educated in law, and he has an advisory firm that focuses on monitoring biodiversity through the activity of bees, which of course gives you the spectrum of activity and information that I'm sure streams through his mind every day. And we have Dan, Dan Altschuler, who is investing in startups that are hitting it big. Beyond Meat is one example. We've heard over the last days how impactful and how successful that has been, and they've gone public and with quite a bang. And we'll hear all about what alternatives are on the market to really move forward into the new paradigm, which we talk about so much. Mike Lee has a food innovation company, and he is trained to really think in a 20 to 30 year perspective, so it'll be interesting to hear realistically from him what his vision is. And then, yes, policy. We need policy, we need peacekeeping activities, and Emilio instead is trained in political science, and that is his perspective and his outlook. So some facts to kick off the conversation. I think it's a good opportunity, the fact that we're here in Milano and people who come from abroad are always so happy to be here, that we spread our wings for a moment. We do have the highest biodiversity. We're the country with the richest biodiversity in Europe, both in terms of flora and in terms of fauna. And just to run some numbers, that means we have 58,000 animal species, only 2% are vertebrate, which I thought was very interesting. And in terms of flora instead, we have 6,711 vascular flora species, 15+% which are endemic. We have a million of hectares dedicated to organic farming, which also makes us the country with the most in Europe, the country that has the most organic farming, and also one of the first countries in the world. Having said that, though, we also have some tough news, because the extinction rate is kind of devastating at a global level. We're looking at 1,000 to 10,000 times higher today than the so-called background extinction rate, which I think is a very interesting parameter because it looks at how any species would go extinct or not go extinct if we weren't around. So it's kind of an interesting calculation that someone actually figured, you know, what would the planet look like without humans? Well, so starting with Emilio, but then any question is for everyone. The Convention on Biological Diversity was born at the Earth Summit in 1992. 192 countries plus were part of that convention. What has been achieved in a few words since then?
Since that, first of all, good morning to everyone. I think that what we are looking for in the last few years is some kind of awareness that we lost in the past decades. I came from Terni. There's a small town in the center of Italy in a region that's called Umbria that is known in Italy as the green heart of Italy. Actually, today, we live a critical situation because in the last 150 years, petrochemical and iron steel factories polluted all the area. And Terni is like a basin. It's close by, surrounded by mountains. So right now, it's difficult to look in a different way. So we were talking about fauna and flora. What about human beings that are not changing their mentality? Where we live, the most important thing is have a job and work, receive a salary. Doesn't matter where you're working, how, and how much you're destroying your city. Where your kids gonna live? So we have a big lack of awareness right now. That's why we're working on it. Actually, we work in a kind of a hard area because we are cannabis producers. So
I have a question on that for you
later. We have all the problems around that.
Okay, I will get to that later because there's, you know, it's useless that I tell you the fascinating facts about the plant. But so basically to answer my question, where it's not a very good perspective from the 92 to now. What have we achieved? Not much. We've lost a lot of awareness, we've lost biodiversity, and we're trying to revert that. Any?
I would disagree that we've, hello? Yeah. I disagree that we've lost awareness. I think today's generation, millennials, thanks in part to all the technology that's around us, the iPhone, social media, Netflix documentaries, there is a growing awareness of the challenges to the environment, growing awareness of the links between food, health, and challenges such as sustainability. And we are starting to see a shift. We come at it from an investment point of view, and we believe that in order to create a positive impact on the environment, on health, on the planet, it requires a dramatic shift in consumer behavior. At the same time, the realities are that consumers can only be changed in a very slow way. Hence, companies such as Beyond Meat, to give an example, have started by introducing consumers with products that are similar to what they've been consuming for decades, but with a slight modification. In this case, these are products that are being created using plants as proteins rather than animals. So I do think that there is a significant shift. I think there is growing awareness. I think there are improvements in technology, primarily within the food sector and transportation, that are allowing to change it. But at the same time, the realities is that to feed a 7 billion plus population and change their consumer behavior will take some time.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. We've gotten more awareness. I want to build on that and say that I think as we think about the future and specifically think about biodiversity, we have to be careful not to just trade one monoculture for another, right? And so while I'm so excited about the things that Beyond Meat and things that are doing, I wonder sometimes, should we end this idea of food trends? right? Because I think the models that we have in the financial markets and with companies, they really at this point reward kind of people scaling up one or a set of things in a very, very massive way, where is if we really want to kind of reinforce biodiversity, does that mean that companies are selling 10 different products with 10 different ingredients instead of one different product with one ingredient, you know, something like that. So
I agree. I think the reality right now we have two crops, wheat and soy, that account for the majority. But we are starting to see a shift. I'm just saying, you know, everything from lentils to duckweed to other legumes such as choclo. But the realities are that the volumes aren't there yet. And shifting agriculture at the source for the volumes that we're talking about, considering the growth in human population, will take decades. And the awareness, I think, is also there from governments. It's just that they take a long time to react.
It's interesting to see that it's starting, we've been working 10 years now with companies and local authorities and so on, and we see a shift since 5 years with companies being more and more aware of the situation, and you can see a difference between different countries. In France, for example, they just passed a law yesterday on social responsibility, and so they're trying really to get companies to get into that move. And you can see that in France, companies understand it, and they anticipate the situation, and they start investing in biodiversity. Whereas in other countries, it's still a bit slow, but you see something going on, which is positive. It's about time, but you can see a shift going on with policies as well, I think.
Well, that's very encouraging, actually. So you're the only one who sees a negative trend yet. He's really more the policy guy. I think that okay, we know that laws and any kind of policy integration does take time. Interesting that you say that changing habits takes time. I focus a lot on stimulating habit change. I've never really considered the time trajectory, maybe because I'm so moved by a sense of urgency, right? So I guess that your point about Beyond Meat making a burger that really looks like a beef burger is an interesting perspective. So we have this shift in awareness. We have, though, a scaling issue, because it's very exciting to hear that you have money coming into new ventures and there are successes. On the other hand, big corporations, in terms of size, you know, make everything else look still kind of tiny. So how do you see this sense of urgency and need being met by humans being so habit-driven and policies being so slow to transition and habits being so, you know, slow to move?
So yes, there is a sense of urgency, and I think right now we're living in a world where we expect instant results. So I think we have to set real expectations. If we think about it, at the turn of the 19th century, millions of horses were bred in the US alone for transportation purposes. Mr. Henry Ford came along, developed an inexpensive car, and 30 years later that became a very niche micro-industry. So things take time. I would say that large corporations right now have bought into the fact that plant-based alternatives are a reality. They are putting money, they're putting resources into it. You have companies such as Tyson, who has declared that they are now a protein company, not an animal protein company. So there is a large shift in consumer behavior, in corporate behavior that is happening. So it's encouraging, but we just need to set expectations. What the best part of everything is that consumers are demanding products more and more. And the market is trying to fill the gaps. And if we think about the progression of alternative proteins since the 60s, when these were eaten by people who had a philosophical reason for doing so, now people are doing so just because they like it. And so we can see, I'd like to measure things in a larger time of gap, just to understand everything that's involved.
I think that last thing you said is so important because I think accelerating change, especially with food sustainability, the thing that it hinges on is you have to make it super, super easy for people. Right? I think people in our circles, people that come to this conference, we're very mindful of the impacts of sustainability, biodiversity, but like to really scale this, you have to get the middle of the bell curve, the people that don't come to these conferences and don't think about this every day. And honestly, a lot of those people, they just want tasty food that makes them feel good, you know? So I think Beyond Meat really hit on it because they sort of took this Tesla strategy to selling a veggie burger. We've had veggie burgers for a very long time. But Beyond Meat said, you're going to eat this because it's sexy, and then by the way, it's also sustainable. You know, not it's sustainable, ... You know, maybe it tastes good or not. So I think that's super important. Consumer change does take a long time, but if you make it super easy for people, you can accelerate from there.
And the naming is kind of
it's marketing
clever too.
storytelling.
It's really okay. Michael, can you tell us a bit about your bee monitoring system? And it's interesting how you know, you're not a biologist, rather you're a lawyer. I like the combination of your you know, your training and what you're doing, and the fact that you're advising companies, big companies.
Yeah, so my associate is a biologist, and he did a PhD on and developed the tool during that period. So the tool is quite easy actually. Bees cover a large surface to feed themselves, and they feed themselves with nectar and pollen. So they cover 700 hectares, and they're going to visit billions of plants, and they bring back in the beehive pollen and nectar. And the advantage with pollen is that it captures pollution, so air pollution and soil pollution, and it contains the DNA of the plant. So we basically analyze the pollen to see whatever kind of pesticide there is, heavy metals and other pollutants. And we also see what kind of plant diversity you have. So we can see exactly at what period of the year there's an issue, either in terms of pollution or in terms of biodiversity, and what can be done, where it comes from, what can be done, etc. And so we can help companies, local authorities to solve issues and to improve the environment.
While the monitoring is quite straightforward and intuitive, what can be done is a bit less. What can be done?
So what can be done, that's complicated, it's true. Small things can be done, you know, in terms of biodiversity. We work a lot in terms of plant diversity, insects, and so on. So citizens can do a lot about that. You know, a lot of them have gardens, things. They can change their habits and the way they manage their sites. Companies can do the same. In terms of pesticides, we work a lot with farmers, and it's nice to see that they say, well, when we see indicators, we understand that we really have an impact on the environment and on our own health. And starting from that point, they're happy to, you know, go into a discussion and to learn more about how can we change things. And there's other ways of, you know, doing agriculture and other ways of farming today. So we help them with other techniques, and technology can help on that aspect. Heavy metals is a more complicated issue because those are huge companies issuing those heavy metals quite often. But then that's when governments and policies have to come in the game and try to change that aspect as well. And what we see, it's nice to see that companies are willing to change also because of the market, as you said, but because also of the youngsters and their employees. Actually, they all tell us today to have interesting talents coming in the company, we need to be sustainable. We need to prove that we do something about biodiversity and so on. And so it's nice to see that that generates a trend as well.
Thank you. All very interesting. Now, going back to what Emilio was starting to say, I'm going to use this question that then you can all pick up to address the issue of bias and cultural, cultural biases or cultural opportunities. Hemp, from a biological point of view and environmentally, presents enormous advantages. It's quite a generous plant. It can really enrich the soil, absorb CO2s. We can eat the seeds. We can make fabric that has a footprint that is infinite times lower than cotton. It has components that do have a number of health benefits. As I'm sure you know, there was a festival just a few days ago, and no newspaper really spoke about the benefits of the plants, rather the police raid that went through all the, you know, the people who were showing their products, found a few with a content that was superior, not legal, and so that's what papers talk about. So give us in brief your perspective, but then cultural bias and biodiversity. For example, when we opened this fantastic event, we spoke about how many edible plants there are. Yes, we know we rely heavily on 4 crops, so it's like, you know, yes, that we're more demanding, but are we getting smarter, really, or not? Are we honoring the incredible intelligence that plants have? And we can give a few interesting pointers from Stefano Mancuso's research in a moment.
We are getting into what plants can really give to us nowadays in a mainstream opportunity. So when I was talking about the lack of awareness, I meant that we live in a time that there's a lack of memory also. Social medias and internet and all that stuff help us to communicate and to spread the message. But sometimes that message reach us and then goes away. So our challenge is to get this message stable on youngsters' minds and ours too. Years ago, I couldn't imagine to found a startup on a biodiversity and regenerative agriculture sector. It was totally far from me, from what we were. But actually, living in a town where pollution is, I think, is the 3rd most polluted city in Italy, and one of the first 10 in Europe. So cannabis is coming out some 100 years cultural cage, and it's hard because Italy actually was the first hemp producer at the beginning of the century. The 70% of the British Army tools and instruments and ships and wires and all was made with Italian hemp. And we were the first quality producer in the world, and the second for quantity. Second just for the Russia was a great producer. So we lost that culture, and we are trying to using it again, because it actually is a circular plant, because it feeds the soil, absorbs heavy metals, it absorbs a quantity of CO2 is 10,000 more than a forest of 6 years. And actually, cannabis is a crop rotation, so it's not really used right now. And we're trying to restore this farming. And it's not just feeding the soil, but it feeds ourselves, the seeds and also the cannabinoids, that the only one molecule that change DNA right now. So it's a big step.
Any other? I hear it. Is it coming from our speakers? Do you hear it too? Joan? No, you don't hear it? It's coming from another room, sorry.
Speaking about social bias.
Yes.
We see it a lot in food. Food is something very personal. Exactly. It's part of our cultural heritage. So when we're talking about things such as animal proteins, in countries such as in Latin America or in China, where there was a limited amount of animal protein available, eating meat was a rich man's food. So right now, the reason that we've seen such a growth in pork consumption in the world is mainly because of China. And as the consumers there have had more purchasing power, they've been switching over. So those are some of the markets where we see a cultural bias that will be one of the biggest challenges in doing the switch, because people right now, they aspire to eat meat. Whereas in countries such as all over Europe and the United States, people are understanding that maybe animal consumption is not as good. So there's many different points of view that we need to understand the nuances on.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, a burger is associated to manlyhood and strength and power and, you know, all those things that really came, as you were saying, by exporting a model. And I think that's the responsibility we have also when we talk about developing countries. We still are exporting a model that is no longer up to date. We kind of should, and that's where speed again of change, I think, is relevant. Because until developing countries say, hey, you behaved like that until yesterday, in fact, you're still behaving like that, then it's hard to say we're honoring a higher good and we're asking you to change before we actually change. So I don't know whether, Mike, you might have a comment on that, or any of you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Dan says, but I think part of the, you know, we have to work on continuing to reduce cultural biases, because I think one of the biggest parts about biodiversity, a lot of people ask me, what can I do to help support biodiversity in my day-to-day life? It's pretty simple. Just eat one new food a week, right? And if you expand your diet from eating 4 things to 8 things to 16 things, that can help biodiversity by building markets and building up volumes for some of these crops that don't have volumes right now. So part of that, I think, is to kind of, the less cultural bias you have that your country has all the answers, the more free you are to explore other countries' foods, right? So crops like fonio from Africa, crops like baobab, you know, these things are kind of foreign foods, and I think to the extent that we can be more international citizens and explore the more diverse flora and fauna that the Earth has, that helps biodiversity, and you have the added bonus of being able to learn about another person's culture and reducing cultural bias. So I think those two are very intrinsically related, cultural bias and biodiversity.
Michael, do you see cultural bias as an inhibitor or a driver or an element that you have to deal with?
Well, to be honest, I don't know the word cultural bias, so that's...
Well, cultural bias is when there is a convention, of something being a certain way. So meat being, it's an association of attributes and values. Hemp is demonized in Italy, and despite the fact that, even big names in fashion had major investments in the production of hemp for the textiles, but, today you can't do that. Burgers are associated to a whole, series of attributes that's what cultural bias means.
Okay. It's probably a big issue today, because to change that is complicated, I assume. And it relates to consumers. How can you change the way consumers will act? And that's, we talk about policies. I don't believe that policies will really change the biodiversity issue. The biodiversity issue will be changed by each and every one of us. And it starts with changing the way we eat, changing the way we act. And when you talk about, other countries, development countries, you see that we met a lot of those big companies exploiting soil over there. And they say, well, actually, when we go there and say we can reduce pesticides in Europe and so on, let's go to Africa. They tell us, well, no, in Africa, we want to increase the use of pesticides to have more production in Africa. And so those are really the big companies that everybody know about. So at one point you say, how are we going to do to manage this situation? And I think it's awareness and people asking those companies to change the way they produce food.
Well, big companies give big messages, and it's the whole issue about transgenic seeds as well. I mean, it's a very complex issue, but people see, a field that's come up like that, and we want things easy and fast. So it's a very complicated thing. But Mike, you were talking about the fact that, let's eat something new. It's a very interesting lead, and it's wonderful. Now, the scale, though, I'm thinking of the slow food movement, for example, which I've followed in quite in detail and in depth over the years. Now, what happens if any of us are producers of some excellence, an almond that comes from a particular place, or, in Italy we have so many regional specialties, it's wonderful. Now, once you bring that to the attention of the market, everyone will want it. So you hit a tipping point that I think should become embedded in all communications. You can have so many, but then past then, you're destroying biodiversity. You're not protecting that species. So how local should the preservation of biodiversity be? Because, you know, then we all get excited about things that come from very far away, but then you're having a demand that might be surpassing the natural capacity of supply.
Yeah, so you have to really moderate that, right? So there was an anecdote that I saw at a sushi bar once in New York City that really described the state of biodiversity in food in the United States right now, which is, I was sitting down at a sushi bar, and typically when you have a great sushi chef, you get the omakase, and they kind of spread out the love amongst a diverse amount of fishes, right? And that's a beautiful way to eat, and it's not only delicious and fun to explore, but it also kind of doesn't stress out any one specific type of fish at any time, right? So that's great. Guy sits down next to me and he says, "Oh, I don't want that. I want 20 pieces of tuna." We have this innate ability as humans to find one thing and beat it to death, right? And so part of this kind of exploration is that you have to kind of moderate it. And that's why I think, like, you know, a lot of people always ask me, like, I talk about the future of food a lot, and they say, like, oh, what's the future of food? Like, what is the next food trend? And I often say to them, I think the next food trend should be the end of food trends. This is the problem, right? People love to write articles about how kale is the new superfood, or tuna is the new whatever, or this or that, right? And that might be true, but we have to kind of tamper that and say, like, okay, you can eat kale, but you should eat this too, you should eat this too, you should eat this too. That's harder to really navigate for a lot of people because humans, I think, can only hold so many things in their head. So it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek when I say eat a new food every single week because, you know, that's difficult to do. But I think we need to kind of go at that with that message to just get people to explore a little bit more. So, you know, that's what I think you can't take it too far when you're trying to do this kind of expansion of people's diets.
Yeah, and really communication is key, and it's complicated because then we want to be having impact on a lot of people, but then if you're sending the same message to a lot of people, you're getting caught again in that weird loop. So let's hear a bit from our other men here on the balance, you know, the concept of tipping point and local, global, obviously in relation to biodiversity, and also maybe the concept that diversity of attitude and of experience is really the best thing for biodiversity.
When I think about biodiversity, I think about something local. I think about human beings. We are here because we are all different. We are all the same, but we are all totally different. The same as food, and the same as fauna and flora. So the point when you go mainstream and okay, I like Chinese food and Thai food, but I cannot eat it every day. Which is the impact of transporting, trading food from Thailand or China or whatever. So biodiversity for me maybe it's not eating everything and farming everything everywhere, but giving the chance to local production to keep living and get away from extinction. So actually, we are what we eat. We know that. And Mediterranean diet is one of the best in the world, but I don't think that maybe it could have the same effect on a Japanese or a Chinese or somewhere else.
Now, for example, do you think that Beyond Meat, let's imagine Beyond Meat selling burgers everywhere in the world. Do you think they'll be using local vegetables and local ingredients? Because then again, otherwise we have a scaling issue, don't we?
I think that is the promise. I think that is where food companies want to get to. I do envision a world where we have manufacturing facilities across the different continents that have similar access to technology, and then they are using the local raw materials at the end of the day to modify the food to the local palates, but using the raw materials that are found within those areas. So I think a balance between that for what we could call more processed foods, and then a stronger understanding by consumers that eating what is local and what is in season is better. I think this idea of eating strawberries all year round or eating avocados all year round, which has been pushed by corporations, with a bottom line focus strictly is part of the challenges that we're facing. And that's one of the promises of indoor farming, is being able to take all these different crops and being able to grow them at a local place.
But when you say we, it'd be interesting to know if, you know, as an investor in startups that are really scaling, if it's incorporated kind of in a compliance, social responsibility, CSR. I mean, there's so many different tools. It'd be kind of lovely if one were to commit. It's the same thing that, you know, I wished, for example, were done with Italy in New York. I mean, in Brooklyn, they make very good mozzarella. Why do we need to be shipping mozzarella from Italy? You know, where there is a local alternative, why not use it? And I think that if it were in the, you know, in the DNA of a company as it starts, that as it will scale, it will use local ingredients, obviously, you know, on a set menu.
That is something that we're actually working on with some of our startups. So I can say, I can't speak for all companies, and I don't think regulation is the key to changing. At the end of the day, I think consumers are the key. Consumers get a chance to vote every day with their wallet.
Yeah, but there's a lot going on. There's a big gap between how things are produced and the consumer awareness. So
I would say that that's coming less and less. People have a stronger understanding of where food is coming from. People are expecting more. You can see the rise of the growth in alternative proteins, similar to the rise of organic products. Took time to develop the supply chain, but it's happening. And now there is more and more awareness. Consumers are expecting this from large corporations, and large corporations are changing. I agree it's not a perfect scenario, but I think it's better than the alternative.
Michael, is the health of your bees, who are kind of like, you know, you were saying earlier that they're kind of like drones, and but bees are, you know, a vital link. They really are the linking element, aren't they? And how do you monitor the health of your bees? Do you?
So first, we've been monitoring the health of bees in Europe. So my associate did that during 10 years. And the situation went from a loss of bee colonies from 10% on average to more than 30% now on average. So, of course, it's honeybees, but it's a great indicator of how it's going for other pollinators. And when you see all the monitoring today results in terms of insects, it's the same trend. So we noticed that our bees are doing well because, of course, we've been acting, you know, locally. Each time we monitor things, we act to solve the issue, especially in terms of biodiversity. We talk a lot about pesticides in bees, but we forget always that they need to feed themselves, and that's probably the most important. And with urbanization, farming, etc., we forget that the species need to feed themselves. And so that's a big issue today. And again, it's all about how you can act locally, you can eat locally, but you can also work on the local biodiversity and do things to preserve your local species, which is very important. Plantations, for example, you see the trend 10 years ago was to import plants and to start planting plants that don't come from, from your country. That's something that people start understand, and you have to change that, and you have to keep your ecosystem, preserve it, and act locally.
But you find that there, I mean, because it's interesting hearing your perspectives, you know, obviously by saying that there is a trend of interest, you're also stimulating that to grow. But realistically, because, okay, before I ask you that, I'm just going to read a few points from the Aichi Biodiversity Targets. I mean, someone needs to help these policymakers communicate. Okay, awareness about sustainability, from fish to forest, elimination and phase out and incentive and reform of incentives and subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity, halt rate of loss, pollution management, invasive species management, anthropogenic pressure on coral reefs, conservation of at least 17% of I mean, you read all these points and you're like, okay, you're talking about saving the planet in a very non-sexy way, And you have given so many focus points that you look at them and you're like, this is impossible. I mean, I think how policies are worded, because then we're talking about scaling from there, is really important. I mean, I don't know who has the biggest experience with policymakers, but if you do, have your word.
What we see is that the problem with policymakers is that they have a short-term, mandate. So it's 4 years, 5 years. Biodiversity issue is quite a long-term process. So when we go to governments or local authorities and say, well, we're going to do a project and you're going to see impact in 4 or 5 years or more, well, they say, no, I need something to get some votes in 2 or 3 years. So that's, for me, what we experience, that's the big problem with policymakers today, is that they don't understand it's a long-term process, but there's an urgency to start now. So
They have a short memory, a short period to do what they have to. And look, how long has been the fight of human rights? So we're starting right now to fight for our planet, and it takes a long time. Policies, maybe sometimes they are not so focused on what people and environment needs on a short time because of their mandate that's too short, but also because maybe it's not a priority, because you don't see every day some changes if you don't know how environment works. So it's hard to.
Okay, let's take a jump forward, Mike. Really, I know that trends, I love your line about the best trend is to not have trends anymore. But I'm sure, you've explored all sorts of different scenarios. Do you think we will be integrating, as already some people who I have met in the Silicon Valley are doing, our diet so much with pills that we will be on a pill-based diet? Do you think that we will be able to restore all this wonderful intelligence that plants and animals and nature in its complexity has to offer? What's your outlook?
I think it's all of the above. So we are no longer one monolithic tribe of food people, right? So if you look at the United States, if you're a large food company, typically your model is find one humongous segment, go after it, nail it, give them one product, and you're done, right? That doesn't work anymore, because I think because we're digitally empowered and we can kind of form these little clusters of like, oh, I eat keto, I eat paleo, I'm a vegetarian, I'm a vegan, all these things, we've become these micro tribes of people, right? So to your answer, like, are we gonna be eating pills or Soylent or whatever? Yes, and all these other things as well too. There will be a tribe that's going to gravitate towards things like pills and things like that, and that'll be their thing, but that doesn't mean that that's going to be the prevailing thing necessarily. So, again, it's sort of counterintuitive, but I think that the future of food is everything, and I think we have the wherewithal now to find our food tribe, find the people that align with our food values, whether I think they're good or bad or whatever, and then there's a market out there for those tribes, for companies to come and service them with the products that they want. So I think that's the hard part about answering this idea of what is the future of food, is that it's not one thing, it's not one thing at all.
Well, diversity of solutions. Now, from your perspective, Dan, who's knocking at your door that you find really exciting right now? What?
Before that, the way that we imagine the future as it relates to consumption of proteins is a pyramid. At the top, it'll be traditional animal proteins. These will be much more expensive. They will not be eaten on a daily basis by consumers, so it will be the equivalent of grass-fed beef and so forth for all species. In the middle, we envision a hybrid of cell-based proteins and a mix of cell-based and plant-based proteins. And the bottom of the pyramid, the most available proteins, we envision them coming from plants and from fungi.
And you haven't put insects in your pyramid.
We don't believe that insects are a solution to the problem. There's cultural bias for example, and we equate them to animals in terms of our vision of what is better for the environment, for the planet, for humans. That's a personal decision that we've made as part of our investment thesis, so we don't put them in. Having said that, I was born and raised in Mexico, where insects are actually part of the culinary heritage of the country, so I understand them. But we've studied the issue, and we have not seen that consumers are excited about insects in a recurring manner. People will try them once to say, wow, but this is not something that people gravitate towards again and again, and that's what you need when you're developing a food business, a product that people want to come to time and again.
Michael, is food in your conversations?
Well, you know, biodiversity, food, it's very related. Yeah, so totally. I mean, you know, if you don't have pollinators, 70% of your fruits and vegetables disappear. So it's strongly linked, of course. So it's totally in our discussions. Now, knowing if insects is not the future, I don't know. I think that the important thing is that there's a huge opportunity for startups, and so you invest in startups. With this global issue about biodiversity in food, but in plastic waste, and etc. There's a huge opportunity. And what I think is positive is that you see a lot of startups going into those opportunities. And that's probably the positive aspect I see. And when you say, how are we going to change that? Sometimes, you know, when I go out of those big companies, I feel completely depressed. And then you see startups doing things and changing the situation. And that's probably the most positive aspect, including in the food business, yeah.
Now, Dan, the startup ecosystem is kind of like biodiversity. There's a lot of gains and a lot of losses in the sense that many people, you know, seek investment or maybe make the seed, you know, stage, but then they fall off the radar. Overall, how do you see that, and how do you see the diversity of the offers being something vital, or people, I mean, what's your outlook on this?
There's the growing interest in food in general, combined with the growing excitement about entrepreneurship, has really created a fabulous ecosystem. We are seeing it around the world for all different points of view, all different types of products. We are a global fund, so we've done investments in China, India, New Zealand, Mexico, Israel, all over Europe, and the United States. And we are seeing that in each of these different markets, there is an excitement and there is a drive towards innovation. And it doesn't have to be companies that are developing something with a very high level of intellectual property. We've got companies that are just developing very good recipes, finding a good manufacturing process, and bringing great products to market. So I think, and the beauty is that more and more we have a lot of available manufacturing capacity for certain types of products, which makes it easier for the micro consumers, the small tribes, to say, yes, I can actually take this product to market. What's important to understand is that not all businesses are venture capital worthy. And that's fine. You can develop a wonderful business selling $5, $6, $7 million a year, be profitable, and have a good business. And I think we're starting to see more and more of those around. There's more access to packaging. There's a lot of accelerators that are promoting entrepreneurship. And distributors are more and more on board. And from a distribution point of view, we also have much more channels to get to consumers. So there's the direct channel, there's online sales, there's all these different companies that are helping promote new products. So I see that we have a lot more innovation. If you go to Expo West, which is probably the best trade show in the US for natural and specialty products, every year the show gets bigger and bigger and bigger with more brands. So I think that is that's proving out that thesis.
Okay, now I'm very happy to see that there is a taste here at Seeds and Chips of Broken Nature, which is the Triennale in Milano, and it will be on for 6 months, and it explores how design can contribute to restoring our broken relationship with nature. It has a host of brilliant solutions. It's curated by Paola Antonelli, who's a senior curator at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And make sure that you go see this stand here, because Paola decided to treat plants as a nation. And the pavilion is curated by Stefano Mancuso, who is a rock star because he has proven to the world that plants are intelligent, and his data is massively impressive. And he has a lot of data, and then he ends with a constitution, which, you know, when you read the Constitution of the Nation of Plants, I don't know, I mean, I'll give you a few pointers, but I would want to be living there tomorrow. The earth is the common home of all life with its own sovereignty, based on relationships between organisms, that does not acknowledge animal hierarchies. Rather, it promotes widespread and decentralized vegetal democracies. It guarantees the right to pure water, clean soil, uncontaminated air, forbids to consume resources that are not renewable. It has no borders. It is free to move. It guarantees mutual support. I've put down a synthesis, but every point is you know, it's a declaration of rights in 10 points. Now, we do have a form of arrogance that maybe when we talk about biodiversity, we should learn to put aside. And I think that a big driver is always curiosity. So how important an ingredient was curiosity in the beginning of your paths in what you're doing today? And how do you associate maybe curiosity as the ingredient we need, you might have others to suggest, in order to shift our attitudes and really come closer to honoring the, you know, the rights of this wonderful natural world that we're part of?
My curiosity and my journey in food started with this really interesting question that we asked ourselves that said, could we build $1 billion brand based off of biodiversity? Like, is that even a thing, right? And so what we landed on was this startup, which is far from being $1 billion company, but it's a startup which is far from being $1 billion company, but we're working on a snack brand that is essentially grain-based brands that are based off of grains that are grown in a polyculture, in a crop rotation. Typically, a large company, like a cereal company, would say, we have this idea for cereal, and all of you wheat manufacturers are going to make this one type of wheat for us, and you're going to make a lot of it, and you're going to make it cheaply, and go, right? And so the farmers kind of have to bend their will, and kind of that's how monocultures get created, right? Because they can't afford not to grow wheat any given season. For us, we're basically saying, we're not even coming at them with a single specification of we need this one wheat. We ask them, in your region as a farmer, as a grain farmer, what are the 8 to 10 crops that you grow in rotation that keep your soil healthy? And then they tell us what those are, and then we say, great, we're gonna take those and work hard in the kitchen to make a delicious snack out of them. We're starting with crackers. Crackers, because they're delicious, you don't have to explain to anybody what a cracker is, but it's also sort of like the meatball of the grain snacks, because you can throw a lot of different things into a cracker and still make it work. Try taking a bunch of yellow peas and legumes and making a good loaf of bread with it. It's very difficult, but you can actually make a cracker with it. So, you know, instead of us kind of imposing our will as a food production company on the farmer to say, build this one thing, we want to say, you plant a legume, you plant a wheat, you plant flaxseed, you plant this and you that. We'll take as much of that as we can, and then we'll integrate that in our product. So the idea is that if that blueprint can scale to $1 billion, you know, how many farms can we convert from planting just monoculture wheat to planting the proper rotation, right? And so, you know, it's those kind of curious questions that kind of really led us to ideas like that, and we're just getting started. But, you know, I think that's going to be a big part of how the future of grain economies and other agriculture economies kind of scale is let's scale biodiversity on a local level and a polyculture level and get away from these monocultures.
What a good narrative. Great.
Thank you.
His story was reminding me of a great US startup called Regrind. And so they're taking a different concept, but I think it relates a lot to what you shared. And what they're doing is they are taking spent grains, which is a byproduct at microbreweries, and they are picking up all these products from microbreweries and they are processing them. So they are taking products that otherwise would have been thrown away or burnt or used for animal feed and developing different types of products. So that type of curiosity of finding how can we create something from waste, in a sense, how can we reduce waste management is something that I find very interesting. It's not exactly our investment mandate, but I think that is a great part of reducing consumption, or reducing waste, and improving efficiencies throughout the global food system.
I think that curiosity brings also innovation, and that innovation brings curiosity. And so we, for example, work today with a big food producer in France, and when they saw our tool, they said, "You're doing that with bees? So why? How?" And so they were curious about what we were doing, and they just started by curiosity with us. And today it changes the whole way they work with the pesticides and things, and so it's changing their research and development strategy and so on. And so it's true that curiosity, trying things, being visionary, is probably the way that we will solve the issue.
And how did you get onto your journey with bees?
Well, my driver was about being happy in life, and so making sense in life. And so I probably had to be curious to find what made sense in my life. And it's traveling in South America, and I met a lot of people saying it's the first time we see this kind of situation, no ice anymore, so they didn't have water, so different environmental aspects that they never lived before, and they were suffering about. And so that's what gave me the will to go into the environment. Yeah.
Fantastic. Emilio?
I have to agree with you because I'm half Colombian. I was born there and lived a part of my life in there. And someone says that Colombia is the happiest nation in the world. But sometimes they don't have nothing on what we call a priority, water, but they're happy. So curiosity, the seek of seeing something different, it is possible. We and my partners and me, we are thinking about, it is real, we have to suffer this. There is no solution. It will be a solution. We have to find it. So that curiosity, and sometimes also the situation that we're living into, it brought us to innovate and create and look, the solution is here. Your grandmother told you she were working with hemp 100 years ago, and why not today?
Fantastic. Okay, I think we might have, I could go on for days, but we have to honor the timing here and maybe the curiosity of someone in the room who might have some questions. Are there any questions? Ci sono domande? Serve un microfono lì. Two. Good. They're searching for a microphone. It's coming. I don't think you have to. Okay, we'll give you, here.
Hello, thank you very much. Really interesting discussion. I'm Sharon Natoli from Food Nutrition Australia. My question is for Mike Lee, probably predominantly. I really like the idea, or that the thought that you have about the next food trend should be the end of food trends, because probably the most common question I get working with food businesses is what's the next thing? And so we talk a lot about consumer consciousness rising, but is there a job to do to enable companies to get over or to get past the idea of following the next food trend? Is there a job to do around raising the consciousness of marketing people and executives within food businesses to get them past the idea of wanting to follow a trend that then gets them market share and so on? Raising their consciousness around the sustainability, biodiversity, all those kind of issues.
Yeah.
And is that something that you do, or see that there's a job
I
to be
do
done?
think biodiversity change is going to be led by consumers, and I think the part that industry has to play is we really have to step up our game in how we're communicating to consumers the value of biodiversity. People don't eat statistics. They just don't. And why do we have some of the greatest ad campaigns in the world? Coca-Cola, all these different companies are lifestyle brands. We have a lifestyle brand based off of sugar water. That's mind-blowing, right? And we can, hate on soda all we want, all that stuff, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater and actually say, that is actually brilliant marketing, right? So how can we get agencies that are creating campaigns like that to create something that's really kind of compelling and easy to digest without kind of watering down the idea for consumers about biodiversity? Now, they have to step up their game because, to be honest, biodiversity, by definition, it's much harder to communicate 4 grains than it is 1, right? It's much harder to communicate Dan's whole pyramid versus just saying, just eat beef, right? So I think communicators have to really step up their game and figure out how do you take complexity and make it just as sexy as just do it. Right? I think that's the challenge that business has to really step up to do, because consumers can't get behind something if they don't understand it and they don't feel emotional about it. Food is one of the most interesting things for me because it's the collision of emotion and logic. Ice cream is not logical, but it exists and it's great, right? And so I think we have to realize that as policymakers, as food scientists, as everybody, that you have to translate a lot of these things into regular language, that emotional language that humans understand. So I think that's really the imperative for companies to really step up their game and communicate better.
Thank you. We had another question here, the first row.
Thank you. My name is Giovanni and I work for EIT Food. I absolutely love the question you asked of how local should the preservation of biodiversity be. It's a great question. And so yesterday I was in a couple of sessions with investors, and what they were saying that what they're looking in startups is the ability to have production capacity and scale up and serve probably global markets. So my question is there a tension then between the need to preserve biodiversity, which is very much a place-based and contextual thing, and the ability of private investors, particularly VCs and people that work with in big markets, to actually make this happen through this kind of investment? And maybe another connected question, is there a case to invest in brands that actually do not promise exactly the same products everywhere, like McDonald's does, but actually do exactly the opposite? They say, wherever you go, we will promise something different, but that makes sure that biodiversity and local food is produced, which is, I guess, is also linked to what you were saying before, the need to stop having big trends, then have the adverse effect of actually making something that was supposed to be sustainable into unsustainable, like the history of quinoa, for example.
Who wants to answer this question? Or this series of questions?
I think there is a normal tension between expectations of a company doing good and investors wanting a return on their investment. And I think it's finding that balance with regards to understanding how you can take complex manufacturing procedures, which have been previously building one large facility and from there shipping out all over the world. I think we're going to start seeing a trend towards having more local facilities where there is more sharing of information because there's more access to manufacturing capacity, manufacturing information. So I think that mixing with local raw materials and then localizing the different products to the different tastes will start to happen. In the past, it was much easier to just take the McDonald's model, to your point, and promise the same hamburger every place. And consumers for a long time wanted that. That was the expectation. I think now people, because there's a greater understanding of the richness of food from every different region, then people are more open to that. Look at Italy. Italy for itself, you can't say there is Italian food to an Italian. Someone from Milan is going to have an opinion on pasta very different from someone in Florence, and it's very valid. And I think understanding that richness, which is part of what's happening with this global awareness of different flavors, now people are understanding that there is a lot of good options, not one option that should be shared by everybody.
Any more questions? One last question. Okay, thank you. Over here.
Hi, thank you. Giulia Di Tommaso from Ferrero. We heard recently of the emerging conversation around the New Deal for nature and people. What would be the view of the panel regarding this attempt brought in by corporations as well as major NGOs to bring up the biodiversity at the level of climate change discussions? What would be the view of the panel or what we should be doing collectively to bring up this topic at the boardroom level in every organization? Thank you.
Challenging question, thank you. Who is ready to answer?
Well, as it relates to climate change, our whole thesis is that the global food system is broken, and one of those key drivers is animal agriculture. So one of the key reasons for why we're investing in companies developing alternatives is for a sustainability point of view and to lower the negative effects on the environment, on the oceans, on the forests.
It's a good question because climate change is something companies and big corporations work a lot on. Biodiversity is not something we hear a lot. And generally, the person in charge of biodiversity is very low in the building. You know, but it's basically your resources. And so when we went to England, for example, UK, for example, they talk about return on investment on biodiversity. It's very complicated to prove you're going to have a return on investment on biodiversity, financial, really direct financial return on investment. But those companies have to understand that their resources and the resources of their suppliers and of their consumers depend on biodiversity. So it's a completely other way of thinking in terms of return on investment. And it's the same thing we said we have to change the way marketeers work. Investors have to work differently also, and big companies have to bring it up in the topics that are priorities for them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that we can do on there. One of the things I think, especially in the States, is that the reason why we have 3-4 crops that are the main kind of monocultures there is because there's a lot of government subsidies to make that happen, right? As a farmer, it's much more advantageous for me to just monoculture grow wheat, corn, or soy because the government is really making sure that there's a market for it and making it cheaper. That makes it so much more difficult to scale up another crop that could kind of chip away at that. And not only that, but monocultures reinforce the use of pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, which many of them are reliant on petrochemical fuels, which obviously lead to climate change and things like that. So I think all of the things that we kind of talked about here, from consumers to how do you build new companies, how do you create alternative proteins and like that, all of that is really, really valid and is going to be the thing that's going to chip away at that. But I think also policy and the way that the financial incentives are structured at a government level for certain crops to proliferate in huge ways, that's a big way that we can kind of change things to kind of chip away at that problem.
I think that it will be always a gap if we still thinking that biodiversity is something different from climate change. The same thing.
And to conclude, because we've said so much about the fact that it's a communication issue, I think that bringing biodiversity in the boardroom of a big corporation means maybe accepting the challenge of informing the consumer where your ingredients come from, because we know that the tipping point that we've discussed a number of times have to do with biodiversity. So if you're sourcing ingredients from monocultures, then you can't be honoring biodiversity by principle. If instead you start sourcing, which by the way I know Ferrero has done in different areas of the world, in different places, then you're saying, I honor my tipping point. I know that I can stress that or supply my needs from that ecosystem without stressing it. So it's a very interesting, important thing, fundamental to tie biodiversity. It's a matter of wording because biodiversity is everything, and so is climate change. So Thank you very much. We have to close because I think there's another session coming up, but
Thank
it
you.
was wonderful talking to you. Thank you.